morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'd like to welcome Richard Fontaine here to present his new book. I will leave it to Richard to tell us what the book is about, but I can assure you anything written by Ambassador Blackwill and Richard is bound to be a good read. So over to you, Richard.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. And it's great to be here. And it's always great to see my friend Bilahari. So even if it's all the way across the ocean. So it's good to see you. So the book, and maybe I should even hold it up because I do happen to have a copy. Anyway, it's right here. It's called The Lost Decade, the U.S. Pivot to Asia and the Rise of Chinese Power. And as Bilahari suggested, my co-author, Ambassador Robert Blackwill, and I recently published this book. And what we wanted to do is look at the effort that really began explicitly in around 2011 to put Asia first in U.S. foreign policy. For more than 2 centuries, the United States was always a Europe first power. We had put Europe first for historical reasons. Even in World War II, after Pearl Harbor, Europe was explicitly the priority. And it almost came naturally to policymakers over the years. Starting in 2011, however, the Obama administration announced a change to America's strategic reorientation. The Obama administration said that henceforth Asia would serve as America's priority region, and that the United States would refocus its military, diplomatic, and economic emphasis on the Indo-Pacific. This move was labeled the pivot to Asia. It subsequently took on other terms like the rebalance to Asia and things like that. But the thrust of it was clear, and it was aimed to tap into Asia's dynamism, to respond to China's rising power, to end wars across the greater Middle East, and to limit security expenditures in Europe. And when the pivot to Asia was announced, it was one of these rare strategic initiatives that really won support and favor across the board. Policymakers in both parties, across subsequent administrations, thinkers, and it coupled sound strategic logic with a keen appreciation of the ways in which the world was changing. So we took a look at just how much the United States had or had not actually refocused its time, attention, and resources on the Indo-Pacific and redeployed those from other regions, especially the Middle East, Europe, and North America. And the upshot is that the United States did not actually pivot to Asia in the 2010s. It didn't shift its diplomatic, its economic, or its military attention to Asia from Europe and the Middle East. It did have an Asia policy. The United States did have new initiatives and new relationships and sometimes do more in different areas, but it did not pivot to Asia as was originally intended. Because of that missed opportunity over the course of about 10 years, we concluded, and hence the title of the book, that it was a lost decade. It was a lost decade across which the United States had tried to increase its presence and attention and efforts in the Indo-Pacific, and it did not. And this was, of course, the same decade where we saw an astonishing rise of Chinese power and influence across the board, militarily, diplomatically, economically, and all the rest. We kind of went through this and actually tried to quantify a lot of these things. Today, for example, despite the pivot to Asia, there are more American military personnel in Europe than there were in 2011. The military presence of the United States, despite the end of key wars across the greater Middle East, is roughly similar in the Middle East today to where it was in 2011. The military presence in the Asia-Pacific is relatively similar to where it was before. The diplomacy has been kind of all over the place, depending on who was in office as Secretary of State, as President, what else was going on in the world, what their personal policymaker preferences were. And as I'm sure this audience knows as well as anyone, the United States went from having a very ambitious affirmative economic agenda in Asia chiefly behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement to having none at all, and in fact actually going backwards because adopting more protectionist policies and so forth. So we looked at why the United States didn't pivot, even though this notion seemed strategically sound and got support from across the board. And it was one of these rare things that in different words and in different ways, both the Biden and the Obama and the Trump administration attempted to do. So why? What happened? Well, first, Washington persistently underestimated the China challenge. For too long, there was a faith that through engagement, through trade, through information flows to the rising middle class in China, there would be something approaching the transformation of China itself, either toward a more liberalized, maybe even democratized power, but certainly one that would become more of a responsible stakeholder in the international system. As we saw over time, that didn't happen. And in fact, under Xi Jinping, if anything, it's gone backwards, both in terms of retrenchment domestically and more assertive revisionist kind of a tendency abroad rather than becoming some sort of a responsible stakeholder. That took quite a while for Washington policymakers to wake up to. The second is some of the realities that go along with the United States being a global power. From the outset, the policy of pivoting to Asia was predicated on an expected peace dividend in Iraq and Afghanistan. When Obama came in, he said he was going to end those wars. He announced the forthcoming withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan in 2011, but as we know, that war ground on at great cost for another decade. He did follow through on his commitment to withdraw all U.S. military forces from Iraq in 2011. But in neglecting to leave a residual force there, the Islamic State came in, established the world's largest terrorist sanctuary in the emergent vacuum. And by 2015, the United States was back in greater numbers than had been the case when it left. And they therefore conducted an intensive 5-year resource intensive campaign to destroy the ISIS caliphate. And of course, American troops remain in both Iraq and Syria today. And there was a Libya operation on top of all of that. So the notion of sort of getting out or reducing activities in the Middle East did not materialize as intended. The pivot also assumed a quiescent Europe. When the 2011 pivot was announced, Hillary Clinton wrote a famous article for Foreign Policy magazine where she laid much of this out. In 5,000 words, the word Russia did not appear. Didn't seem to be the troublemaker then that it would become with the seizure of Crimea, and then, of course, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. On top of that, you had some of the residual effects of domestic, I guess you could call it dysfunction in the United States. A bill called the Budget Control Act was aimed to force together Republicans and Democrats by making something so unpalatable that they would have no alternative but to agree. And that unpalatable thing was to cut $500 billion out of the defense budget over 10 years, so-called sequestration. Well, they couldn't agree. Those sequestration caps went into effect, and the result was, just as the United States sought to devote more resources to Asia, the U.S. military was shrinking. The budget was shrinking. The Navy was shrinking for fewer vessels. And so you had pronouncements from, for example, the U.S. Navy and Air Force saying that henceforth 60% of their platforms would be deployed in the Indo-Pacific. That is true, but it was 60% of a small, shrinking force. And of course, the global financial crisis and the long aftermath of that helped to fuel this backlash against trade. It really crested in 2016, got caught up in presidential politics, and that was the very year that President Obama moved for congressional approval of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Act. And voila, by the end of that year, the final two candidates on both sides, including Hillary Clinton, who had previously championed the TPP, all came out in opposition to it. And as we know, when Donald Trump took office, he immediately withdrew the United States from TPP. If you step back from this overall kind of set of reasons why the pivot didn't accomplish more when it set out to do so, you also have this issue in which by declaring an Asia first foreign policy, what the Obama administration was trying to do was to attempt a grand strategic shift in the absence of foreseeing events or a cataclysm. But of course, if you look at the history of U.S. foreign policy, it's generally required an upheaval, or at least the emergence of a major new threat, to turn this sort of great ship of state. Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration on war on America shook the U.S. into a full mobilization for World War II. The emergence of Stalin's Red Army on the plains of Europe and the war in Korea pushed America to vigorously implement its strategy of containment. The 9/11 attacks ushered in the global war on terrorism. The pivot was an effort to get out ahead of that, to try to make it actually less likely that such a cataclysm would occur in the first place. But it's hard to move priorities in the absence of some sort of forcing function. And so the upshot of all this is that this period of roughly 2011 to 2021 amounts to a lost decade. Had the United States pivoted as it intended, it'd be better able to declare a war with China today. It had deeper trade relationships in the region. Countries there would be both less dependent on China and less susceptible to Beijing's coercion. America's diplomatic interactions with key countries would be stronger. The region would have less reason to hedge against U.S. unreliability. And America's chances of prevailing in a long-term competition with China would be greater. So to be clear, pivoting to Asia would not by any means have eliminated the China challenge. What it would have done is make it easier for the United States to manage that challenge. And in fact, you see quite belatedly when the Biden administration came in 2021, it trying to hurriedly put into place some of the things that had been attempted, or at least should have been attempted 10 years before, which is why we amount to a lost decade. But in terms of military posture, new diplomatic framework, some of the economic steps that it's taken, the Biden administration has done some, but it's been a belated pivot and it's been a partial pivot. There are still big kind of missing gaps to it. So we tried to look at the lessons from this decade plus experience to say, well, what should we do now? We concluded that the pivot's was the right strategic impulse back in 2011, and it remains the right approach today. Asia is even more important to the United States than it was a decade ago. As I mentioned, the Biden administration recognized this. Early on, it took concrete steps to try to revive the pivot. It clearly identified China as its top priority. It clearly identified the Indo-Pacific as the region deserving of its greatest attention. But it's run up against some of these same crippling issues as its predecessors: competing crises in the Middle East and Europe, a limited defense budget, a domestic aversion to multilateral trade agreements, and other things like that. So the administration has some real accomplishments in its belated effort to pivot, but it remains incomplete, especially in the areas of economic and some of the defense-related tasks ahead of it. So going forward, there's a few things that we sort of conclude that we should do. And one thing that we shouldn't, maybe starting with what we shouldn't, the United States is and will remain and should remain a global power. And it has a global role to play. It should not and is not going to become a regional power focused only on Asia to the exclusion of its interests and commitments in other regions, especially in Europe and the Middle East. And so while it redistributes priorities and resources, it cannot and should not involve the abandonment of other regions, nor should it be embedded in an assumption that the friendly allies and partners in places like Europe or the Middle East will just step up and sort of maintain security and stability on their own in the absence of an American presence and role in those areas. But that said, there's a lot that can and should be done in order to have sort of a latter-day pivot to Asia. On the economic side, the United States, as again, I think folks on this session will all know, there are two pan-regional trade agreements in Asia. There's RCEP and CPTPP. China is party to one and has applied to join the other. The United States is party to neither, nor does it have anything to offer as an alternative. The United States should join CPTPP while it's doing other things like de-risking economic ties with China and so forth. That people say that's impossible now politically. Both Biden and Trump have come out in opposition to it. And so maybe some stepping stones in that direction would be more politically palatable, pursuing a bilateral or regional digital trade deal, sectoral deals, and so forth. But overall, we need to have an affirmative, not just a defensive, but an affirmative economic agenda in Asia. The United States needs to boost its defense budget. If you look today, defense spending as a percentage of GDP is about 3%. The last time we were around that level was about 1999. That was the height of the post-Cold War peace dividend. As we can see, there's not much of a peace dividend to be had around the world. The demand on U.S. military resources is high and growing in Europe, in the Middle East, and in the Indo-Pacific, just as the military balance in the Indo-Pacific has shifted away from the United States and its allies. If you look year on year to the administration's defense budget, they have requested a small decrease, real decrease. It's a nominal increase, but when you factor in inflation, a small decrease. The Congress will step in to some degree. But we can't remedy the eroding balance of power in the Indo-Pacific and meet our commitments elsewhere without a major increase in defense spending. What we can do, though, is shift some significant military resources from the Middle East. Over the last decade plus, we in the United States have fed this perception in the Middle East that the United States is leaving, has left, is just about to leave, would like to leave. And it's always peculiar for those of us who travel in the region and talk to officials to hear this. And then you look around and you say, well, the Fifth Fleet is still in Bahrain, and we still have 5 air bases there, and we still have troops in Kuwait for, on all this. The military presence in the Middle East is largely the same today as it was 10 plus years ago. And what this has amounted to is the worst of all worlds, this deep and costly engagement in the region while fanning the fears of abandonment. What I think it's really about is not presence, but performance. It's about whether we are perceived as meeting our commitments and being active in the defense of our interests. And that is actually possible to do with less of a military presence, particularly in the air and naval domains in the Middle East, and redeploying assets to the Indo-Pacific and then surging back to the region if that's necessary. Similarly, we can get into this a little bit more, but shifting U.S. air and naval forces from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. Russia is clearly a threat, but it's not the Red Army on the plains of Europe the way that was once the case. It does not pose the conventional threat to NATO that the Soviet Union once did. And so being able to work with our European allies to take on that threat where it exists would still allow for the shift of some military resources from Europe to the Asia-Pacific. And then while we're doing all of these kinds of things, we also advocate increasing our bilateral diplomacy with China. We have, I think, a pretty skeptical view of Chinese intentions. But China's not going anywhere, and neither is the United States. The stakes are high in this competition, and to have more diplomacy rather than less, at a minimum for risk reduction reasons, seems also prudent to us. So I laid out a few things without trying to get into sort of a laundry list of ambitions, what one might do for a latter-day pivot. Clearly not exhaustive. But I would just end by saying I think all of these steps are within our power. The United States has the overall power, the geography, the economy, the technology, the alliances, the values to pivot to Asia, to effectively deal with the profound challenge that China's rising power and ambitions pose. Now, whether we will do that is really up to us. And I hope that at least our little book here provides a modest set of suggestions for how that might be done. So thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Let me say a word to the audience about how Keng Yong and I intend to proceed. Keng Yong will now give his 2 cents worth, at least I hope it's 10 cents worth rather than 2 cents worth. And I will give my few cents worth. And then we'll open up the floor to the audience for questions and have a discussion. Questions, I think, can be posed not just to Richard, but to all 3 of us. And we can have a discussion among all 3 of us. I should have said at the beginning, Ambassador Blackwill is unable to be with us, although he had planned to be, because some bad weather has trapped him. Where Richard Aspen, is it?
That's right. Yes,
The worst places to be trapped. But we'll give him the best benefit of the doubt and wish him well and hope he gets back to DC before too long. If you have questions, please type them into the chat, and they will appear, and we will take them in the order in which they have appeared. The raise hand function has been disabled for this session. So over to you, Keng Yong.
Thank you, Bilahari. I hope all of you can hear me. I was quite interested in this particular analysis by the two authors because one of the questions that we are pondering over in the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies is the future relations between United States of America and the rest of us in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia. And we wonder what good things can we learn from the effort in the past by US President to pivot to Asia. So we went through some of these ideas that the two authors have summarized, and we hope that we can learn something from there, and in follow-up exchanges between our school and the rest of the intellectual community out there, whether from United States of America or from China, we can avoid some of the bad things that we have learned from the past experiences. But basically, the book is actually quite easy to digest because the authors have put together various ideas, pointers where they think previous policy has not been effective. So I think for the limited time we have, I will just comment on some of the suggestions made in the book. They are quite useful, and hopefully going forward, the new policy people in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere will try to learn something out of these experiences in the past. So the first idea is to increase defense budget. We wonder whether that is really very realistic because already the financial squeeze in the US Treasury and other considerations have already made it very difficult to raise more money for defense. Second idea is to strengthen alliance partnerships. This I think we can do, and I hope that one takeaway will be that there will be more effort put into cultivating stronger and more substantive ties with the people in the Asia-Pacific region. This will involve intensified diplomatic efforts, but I think there will be some difficulties, especially on the part of some of our ASEAN colleagues who are always being scrutinized by everybody else around them and in their own country, whether these countries are taking side with China or with the United States of America. But I think it is something that officials can find way to creatively increase the substantive part of the ties between the respective countries in Southeast Asia and the United States of America. We in ASEAN focus a lot on economic integration and to maintain the region as an inclusive and open trade area for more trade, for more FDI. And I think our leaders are going to continue this going forward, even though there will be more and more pressure on the ASEAN countries to think of some other way of engaging the United States of America in economic terms, because trade opening and trade agreement are no longer the way to go. So the focus among ASEAN countries have been on digital partnership, looking at the digitalization and the digital consumer that we have in our region, and hopefully we can try to facilitate more exchanges in the commercial area through the digital platform. we are not sure how this can be pursued without a resistance from the United States of America. And one of the things that we talk about very much among ourselves here is that one of the important platforms used by the United States has been the promotion of democracy and human rights. As you know, some of our member states are still very chary about this kind of agenda, and we do not know how far the new president of the US and the Congress will pursue this. So there is a bit of a concern expressed among some of my research colleagues. But I think the overwhelming concern now among us is with regard to emerging technologies, which the authors have talked about also as a way to pursue a stronger relationship between the United States of America and the Asian countries, Asian Pacific countries. Whatever it is, I think the need now is to find a rebalance, if you like, and to utilize the resources available in the most efficacious manner. Overall, I think most of us who have gone through some of the chapters in the book feel that it is actually quite a concise exposition of what has happened with regard to the pivot spoken so much by everybody else in the United States of America and other European countries, and how to go forward. So although we are skeptical in some quarters with regard to the possibility of having a more balanced financial arrangement to satisfy the budgetary squeeze on the American Treasury, and therefore consequences for our Southeast Asian nations, we think that these ideas are something worth understanding, and hopefully from there, ASEAN member states can obtain a better appreciation of the kind of work they have to do and the kind of intellectual as well as practical policy articulation required to maybe achieve more results from such a kind of analysis on why this pivot by the United States has not really achieved what many people hoped it would. So I think I'll stop here and then we'll take all the comments and questions from the audience. Thank you, Bilahari.
Thanks, Keng Yong. Now let me put my 2 cents worth. Richard, I entirely agree with you that the pivot was a overstated metaphor whose real effect was exaggerated, right? But I've always believed that we all, whether we are scholars or policymakers of various kinds, we all pay far too much attention to events and not enough attention to the processes in which events are necessarily embedded. And the pivot was one such event, right? I think the most significant shift, let me step back one thing. The pivot was just one such event, and we should not, and while it was oversold, if you like, and I think your book does a very good job of exposing how it was oversold and not delivered on what it seemed to promise, it was just one event. But if you shift focus and take a broader and longer view, the most significant shift in US policy towards Asia did not occur during the Obama administration. It occurred much, much, much earlier, in the period roughly 1969 to 1973, when the United States, as part of correcting course in Vietnam, shifted from a general strategic posture of direct intervention on the Asian mainland to playing the role of an offshore balancer. Korea has been a slight exception, but I think that's an exception that's bound to be corrected over time. And as offshore balancer, the US has been remarkably consistent, a consistency that persisted through the period which you and Ambassador Blackwill call the lost decade. Now, it has been consistent for 50 years as an offshore balancer. Now, the role of an offshore balancer needs to be clearly understood. An offshore balancer has a vital role in maintaining stability, and the US has maintained stability by and large in this vast region we now call the Indo-Pacific. But there are also limits to what an offshore balancer can or cannot do. First of all, as you have pointed out, I think in your opening remarks, the US is still a global power and will remain a global power. And important as Asia will be, it will have responsibilities elsewhere, for sure. Right? So Asia is one of those responsibilities, perhaps the first in priority, maybe that should be the first in priority, but it can never be the sole or even the primary responsibility. Secondly, and I think you and Ambassador Blackwill will concede this, China's rise, its military modernization, its changes in economic policy that led to a much more robust economy, China's rise was due primarily to decisions made in Beijing and not decisions made in Washington, D.C. or anywhere else. And if China is now stumbling, it is also due primarily to decisions made in Beijing and not anywhere else. If it's going to recover, its vibrancy is going to be due to decisions made in Beijing and not anywhere else. The period of US dominance, and there is a slight note on nostalgia running through not just this book, many writings by Americans. The period of unquestioned US dominance was actually only a very short period, an exceptional period in Asia. For most of my lifetime anyway, the Asian order was a contested one. Contested first by the Soviet Union and its allies, and now by China. And an order defined by contestation is actually a normal state of affairs. The lack of a contest was a short and abnormal period, and we are now returned to normalcy. Now that said, so China's rise was due to China's decisions. I don't think it could have been prevented or even slowed down by decisions made in any other capitals, not to any significant extent. And if China has now slowed down, it's because of China's own decisions. But I think we should look at China in a holistic way. It is a very important geopolitical fact, but it's not 10 feet tall. Right? If you look at China's geopolitical position in this region and globally, it is not a favorable one. Which countries in this vast swathe of countries from Northeast Asia down through Southeast Asia, through South Asia, into the Middle East, can China really rely upon? I don't think China will ever break its relationship with Russia because it has no other strategic partner of comparable weight. But as long as China does not change its position on the war in Ukraine, there is going to be a sharp limit to how China can improve its relationship with Europe for a start. Who else can China rely on? North Korea? The North Koreans distrust the Chinese almost as much as they distrust Americans. Laos, big deal. Pakistan. Is Pakistan an asset to China or a liability? And I can go on. More than just China's unfavorable position, I think there is a better appreciation now of the vital role of an offshore balancer, the United States, in maintaining stability. Much better appreciation now than, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years ago. It manifests itself in the Quad, in AUKUS, in Japan's significant shift in Japan's security posture. It also manifests itself in quieter, but no less significant changes of attitude towards defense relations in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Philippines, even in Malaysia. And these things should not be discounted. Mind you, these things are much more due to Chinese mistakes than the success of American diplomacy, right? And I think you do a very good job in exposing some of the shortcomings of American diplomacy during that decade. But at the same time, despite China's unfavorable geopolitical position, nobody will ever forswear relations with China. Because of its proximity, its position in the region, because of its size, because of its weight, China will always enjoy significant influence, regardless of what the US chooses to do or not to do. But precisely because of its proximity, because of its size, because of its weight, China is always going to arouse anxieties. And those anxieties are what cause clustering towards the US, which I just described. So there's a certain duality, right, in attitudes in this region. There are concerns about US policy, but the concerns are, I think, not so much due to lack of attention. As I said, US has been remarkably consistent as offshore balancer in this region for 50 years. Not so much due to lack of attention, but the type of attention the US pays to this region. First of all, the lot of an offshore balancer is not a happy one. Let's concede that from the beginning. Your porridge is always going to be too cold to some people and too hot to some other people, and it's almost impossible to get it just right for everyone. Offshore balancer, if it's too active, is going to arouse fears of entanglement. But if it's too nuanced in its approach towards the region, it's going to arouse fears of abandonment. But that's the lot of a major power, and you will just have to put up with it because we have learned to do so. More so, it's not so much, I said, the lack of attention. I said you've been quite consistent, but the type of attention. And that kind of concern is given focus by your forthcoming election, which looks like, unless something very miraculous happens, going to see a second Trump administration. I don't think the effect of a Trump administration on Asia is going to be, disastrous, but it will have an effect. And we'll have to adapt to it. I want to end with just 2 points. One, you have a chapter about not wanting to choose. And I think it's a good chapter, but I think this phrase, which we all use, I've used it myself, Keng Yong has used it, the Singapore government has used it, countries around the region have used it, is often used but not well understood. What do we mean when we say we don't want to choose? So I said, we have to deal with China, we have to deal with the US. We know that. When we say we don't want to choose, we do not mean we are trying to adopt a position on neutrality or equidistance or passivity. What we really mean is we want to choose according to our interests, and our interests may be different in different domains. And we see no need to line up all our ducks neatly in one direction or the other in all domains. Let me give you an example from Singapore, right? For example, in the defense and security domain, it should be patently obvious to anybody who has eyes that we have chosen long ago. We have chosen in the direction of the United States in particular and the West generally. On the other hand, in certain political issues, for example, the idea that the so-called universality of human rights gives countries the right to interfere in our domestic affairs, our attitudes are much more aligned with those of China and for Russia, for that matter. And as far as economic relations are concerned, we are completely promiscuous. We'll play with anybody who wants to play with us, international law and our own interest permitting, of course. And I think in different degrees, that is true of most countries in this region, including US allies. Of course, countries differ in their capabilities, they differ in their maneuver space. For example, a US ally, a formal US ally, will have less space than a formerly non-aligned country like India or Singapore or most of the ASEAN countries. But I think this is the fundamental attitude that we have. And this attitude would have been there irrespective of whether the decade was lost or not, and we can discuss that. My final point is this, and it's a kind of summary of what I'm trying to say. All of us in this region face two fundamental realities. First of all, we have to deal with both the US and China, and we have to deal with them simultaneously. And there's a better appreciation that dealing with both is a necessary condition of dealing with either effectively. At the same time, we have concerns about both certain aspects of both Chinese behavior and certain aspects of both American behavior. Now, the concerns are not the same, nor are they held with the same intensity, but they do exist. Now, you put these two realities together, and what you get? You will get an increasing effort of countries in this region, including US allies, to maximize strategic flexibility. You already see it emerging. You're going to see coalitions of countries forming around different issues, reforming around other issues. Some will include the US, some will include China, some will include neither the US or China. This is a condition that I like to call dynamic multipolarity. And this is not a kind of condition that is unfavorable to US interests, I don't think, because the US will always have a vital, irreplaceable role as the offshore balancer in maintaining stability. But it will only be unfavorable to the US if you try to force this quest for strategic flexibility into some rigid strategic straitjacket or another. I'll stop here. Now, ladies and gentlemen, maybe Richard, you want to respond briefly to Keng Yong and me, and then we'll open the floor to the audience.
Sure. Well, that was great. So thanks to both of you. Maybe just a couple of responses to some of the points that came up. Is it realistic to increase the defense budget in the United States, or is the US so budgetarily cash-strapped that it's just impossible to do it? Well, just couple of months ago, the United States conjured out of the air $95 billion in aid for Ukraine, Israel, and a little bit for the Indo-Pacific, which was neither budgeted for nor paid for because we borrow a lot. The real fulcrum around which our fiscal issues revolve, I guess if you can say that, is in entitlement spending on social programs and interest on the debt and so forth. So yeah, we could increase the defense budget, and I think you will see the Congress increase the defense budget this year by some tens of billions of dollars over what the administration it requested. And I think if Donald Trump is elected president, he probably would do what he did in his first year of office last time and just pick a number out of the air and say it shall go up by this much. He did $70 billion, 10% in his first year. On this issue of sort of not wanting to choose and not being forced by the United States or China to restrict your strategic flexibility, Bill Hari, I think you put it really well there. And I think to some degree, I think this conversation about not wanting to choose becomes a little bit of ships passing in the night rhetorically, because the mantra coming out, not only of Southeast Asia, but, Asia and even in Europe, is we don't want to be caught between the United States and China. We don't want to be forced to choose. Don't make us. And then this sort of call and response is the Americans say, you're not going to be forced to choose. What are you worried about? We would never do that. And of course, it is not the case that anyone, China or the United States, is going to try to force any other country into an overarching all or nothing strategic choice, kind of a la the Cold War, where you have an integrated political, military, economic bloc where the price of joining the West on security matters would be, essentially the cessation of your economic relationship with China, for example. No one's going to do that because the United States wouldn't even sign up to that. I mean, we have a huge economic relationship with China. And if we asked or tried to make countries do that, then they wouldn't do that. But on lots of issues, there will be inevitable choices, right? So, I mean, China wanted to sell Huawei telecommunications equipment in countries. The United States wanted countries to not buy Huawei. You had to choose whether to allow Huawei in on 5G or not. China wants to have military installations in various countries, a sort of global basing strategy. The United States does not want China to have military installations in various places. Countries, not Singapore, but other countries will have to choose. On export controls, for example, again, Singapore is not an issue here, but when the United States put export controls on the export of particular semiconductors to China, that went around to other countries and like the Netherlands and Japan and said, we want you to sign up to these. They didn't have to, but they did have to choose. They had to choose either China's druthers, which is don't sign up, or America's druthers do sign up. So, you know, inevitably there will be many choices for countries on an issue by issue basis in which I think, for lack of a better term, they will be sort of caught between American preferences and Chinese preferences. And then just maybe the final thing that I guess I would, well, two final things. One, Bilahari, I think you're absolutely right that, you know, China's rise wasn't due to what the U.S. did or didn't do, as, you know, a result of Chinese decisions. And I think part of the problem was, for a long time, American policymakers thought that China was sort of the dependent variable. The U.S. was the independent variable, right? And so if we just engage China enough or in the right ways, then it would become a responsible stakeholder in our existing international system. If we just dealt with it in the right ways over a long enough period of time, we would see the eventual liberalization and moderation of China, maybe even the democratization of China. Essentially, if we did the right things, we see the transformation of China. And if we didn't do the right things, we wouldn't. Of course, our Chinese friends will say, well, who told you that we would transform only in response to things that you did or didn't do? And it took a long time for US policy to, I think, abandon the notion that it should be rooted around an objective of transforming China. And now I think that the scales have fallen from folks' eyes. And I think now what you see is a set of policies that aims to respond to China, certainly not to transform it, not even that much to shape it, although there is decisions, although there's some of that, you know, in the defense sphere and so forth. And then maybe just a final point here and this is sort of on the overall strategy, because Bilahari, you were talking about events, and of course, events are not going to stop happening, right? But if you're going to pivot to Asia in however one might define that approach, and we try to do that in our book, then you have to have a strategy that's resilient to events happening in other parts of the world. If we have a strategy that only works when the Middle East is quiet and Europe doesn't demand American resources attention, we will never, ever pivot to the Middle East. And so what you need is a set of approaches that can adapt. So, for example, you know, if you're trying to redeploy military forces, do so in a way that allows you to surge back into other theaters when necessary, but you know, and other mechanisms like that. And so I think that is really part of the essence of what we have to think about now. So anyway, I'll leave my responses, I guess, at that. But thank you for the comments.
All right, thank you, Richard. We have got a couple of questions already in. The first one is from Anne-Marie Slishev. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing your name, so I apologize. But the question is, could you please, and it's to you, Richard, could you please comment on how AUKUS and the US military partnership with Australia will affect the US engagement in this region, in the Asia-Pacific?
Sure. Well, AUKUS, I mean, I think as folks know, AUKUS is the Australian, US, UK, basically defense technology sharing arrangement that was forged about 2.5 years ago or so. It was originally aimed, and it still is in large part aimed at producing nuclear propelled but conventionally armed submarines for Australia to replace their existing submarine fleet. That's going to take a long time. I mean, we're talking a decade or more from start to finish. But if it does materialize, and I think there's grounds for optimism, then it will lead to a significant expansion of essentially the Allied submarine fleet in the Indo-Pacific, which in a region where the military balance has been deteriorating away from the US and allies and toward China is a good thing. It's good for deterrence in the region. It's good for the military balance in the region. The second element beyond the subs is this so-called Pillar 2. This is the advanced capabilities pillar of AUKUS, which aims to develop things in the areas of quantum computing and unmanned systems, especially unmanned undersea systems, and some other areas of really advanced technology that can be shared among the three countries and then adopted and put in the hands of the potential warfighter. Here, there's some progress, but it's been pretty quiet. My sort of exhortation is to show some early wins, given that the subs are going to take 10 plus years to do things that can materialize in 1 or 2 years, and I think there are things in that area. Japan is likely to get involved in 1 or 2 of those projects over time. New Zealand may do the same. Canada is likely to do the same. This has required a significant lift in terms of changing some of these arcane export controls and intellectual property protections on the US side and so forth. But it's the kind of thing that, if successful, and it should be successful, can be a model for how the United States and its allies and partners can work more closely together in sharing key technologies in the defense area, again, as one way to try to improve the military balance in the region.
Thank you. Keng Yong, would you like to comment on that too, on AUKUS?
Yeah. Well, from our research and feedback in RSIS, whatever the US position is not really something that the regional countries, especially those in India, the experts in India, believe in. And it basically creates a lot of what I call competitive dynamics. Yeah. And people are wondering, how do we, as a naval power in the Indian Ocean, I'm talking about India, how can we respond to this? Yeah. Among ASEAN countries, yes, there are people who think that it might be a bigger strategic factor and so on and so forth. So people live with it. But overall, I think the sense is that everyone should wait and see how many of the elements in these AUKUS will play out and impact on the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asian countries. Right now, there is a renewed interest in understanding what ASEAN has done in the past with regard to a nuclear issue. Yeah, so I expect in the coming months and years, there will be more strong reaction in how AUKUS would play out. Yeah, especially the part about nuclear provision. So we wait and see, but I don't think it is generally positive or negative right now. But it is a lot of anxiety, and people in India. I just came back from India. We had our annual dialogue between RSIS and the Maritime Foundation in New Delhi. And there are many people making comments about how regional countries, those in the Indian Ocean, those in Southeast Asia, should respond to this. Whatever the assurances coming out from USA or UK or Australia. So I think we should just find a way to collect all these ideas and eventually perhaps do more public relations and explain some of the more technical elements. Thank you.
Yeah, I kind of agree that there's been a lot of alarmist commentary about AUKUS, about what is really, as you pointed out, Richard, a technology sharing agreement. And the most important part will take a decade or more to come into being, right? I mean, when it comes into being, it will have a significant strategic impact. But, let's neither downplay it nor exaggerate what it means, right? But I have a follow-up question. Richard, in the same ballpark, if you like, there's been increasing interest in NATO. We just saw it in the summit in this part of the world, and there's been increasing interest on some countries in this part of the world in NATO. Now, how far do you think this can go? I think if I remember correctly, there was some kind of defense procurement, a nascent defense procurement kind of cooperation between some East Asian countries and some NATO countries. But how far can this really go? I'm myself rather skeptical because there are two different regions. There are, of course, strategic connections. But NATO has its hands full in Europe, again. So can you comment on this? How far can this really go?
Yeah, it's a great question because NATO descended on Washington last week, so we had all 32 world leaders, or NATO leaders anyway, tying up traffic all over the nation's capital, among other things. But I was at many of these events with them, and the so-called IP4 attended for the third straight year. So although Prime Minister Albanese didn't, he had his defense minister, but so this is New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. And so how far can this go? Remains a matter of some debate. It can certainly go a diplomatic distance, right? So this is the third year the summit has included non-member Indo-Pacific partner heads of state. The NATO strategic concept has defined NATO interests in the Indo-Pacific, not only in the North Atlantic per its kind of original and core mandate. The communique, the joint statement that they put out talk about China's role. I think the Europeans are most alarmed at the moment, not by China's role in the Indo-Pacific, but China's role in aiding the Russian war machine and prosecuting the war in Ukraine, which of course is taking place in their own backyard. So that's all kind of on the diplomatic front. It's also possible to identify where it's not going to go. It's not going to include Indo-Pacific countries in NATO or extend a mutual defense agreement or an Article 5 guarantee to countries in the Indo-Pacific, nor could you count on most NATO countries to get involved in a contingency if one were to break out over Taiwan or something like that. So what's in the middle? Well, the middle is what's sort of being debated now, and there's been some things announced in terms of information sharing, the possibility of defense technology sharing, weapons production, things like that. The inclusion of Indo-Pacific countries in some joint exercises and things like that. So it's here and there. But it's also a little bit two steps forward, one step back. A couple of years ago, NATO announced that they were going to open a NATO office in Tokyo, and President Macron put the kibosh on that. So this year, they announced that office would open in Jordan, not in Tokyo. So there's no NATO office in Tokyo, but there will be one, I guess, in Oman. So anyway, yeah. So shall we say it remains a work in progress?
Thank you. There's a question here from Choi Shin Kok, who is the director of the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, South Asia Institute. And his question is to you, Richard. And it's this: taking into account the change in economic power in the world with the rise of China, don't you think there needs to be a fundamental rethink of US strategy? That is to say, should the objectives be more modest while still seeking to remain preeminent? Modest preeminence. Now, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would have to hear a little bit more about what the alternative on offer precisely is. Preeminence sometimes seems immodest, but and there tends to be a debate in Washington between the more restraint-minded folks and those who believe that the U.S. should continue to exercise global leadership. Maybe there's some Goldilocks way through this, but if you look at, for example, U.S. GDP as a percentage of global GDP has actually risen in the past 2 years, and China's has declined. Now, I think overall you're looking at, other countries certainly rising, with the potential exception of Europe. And so it's a more diffuse international, and it's certainly a multipolar world in a way that it wasn't in the first couple of decades after the Cold War ended. But much of this will be done by, with, and through partners and allies around the world. This is not just the United States on one side of the balance and China on the other, or China and Russia on the other, and so forth. So my view is that the United States still has an indispensable global role to play, and indispensable in really practical ways. So, for example, think about some of the military or diplomatic things the United States has done. When ISIS took over Iraq and Syria, originally the Obama administration didn't really respond. And ISIS began planning attacks in Europe. attracting tens of thousands of foreign fighters, many of whom were coming from Europe. Europe was much closer to the refugee flows that this was in part producing and so forth. But of course, Europe didn't get together and put together a coalition to beat back ISIS. It joined a coalition once the United States led it, but it didn't do it on its own, nor did any countries in the Middle East get together and say, oh my God, look what's happening in our region. Let's get together and do it. If you look at the response to aiding Ukraine and punishing Russia after the invasion, it's hard to say the counterfactual, but it's almost unthinkable had the United States not been the catalytic mover here, that Europe would have provided anywhere close to the military assistance to Ukraine that's helped them survive as they have, nor organized the diplomatic kind of coalition to try to constrain Russia. And so, it's like anything else in life, I guess. What is the available alternative to U.S. leadership? And they all seem to me to be less appetizing than to make the continued effort.
Thank you. There's another question here to all three of us, and perhaps to give Richard a break, you can go first, followed by Richard, and I'll go last. The question is this. During the last Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, Secretary of Defense Austin mentioned that the US is shifting from a hubs and spoke model to a set of overlapping and complementary initiatives. What will this mean for the US approach to Asia, and particularly China and Southeast Asia? This is from Daniel Goh. Go ahead, Keng Yong.
Okay. We are not sure how to analyze this particular angle, although I did say something to someone at the Shangri-La dialogue the other day when it was held, that what it all means, we have to wait and see. The fact of the matter is that physically, we will still see US military presence in our region, and maybe frequency and the size of the military presence may differ from what it is today, but I do not fully appreciate what else can be done. And so far, I don't think it will be very significant to most of us who are hosting some of these visitors or this increased military presence in our region. But I guess something will have to be adjusted, not only with regard to the cost involved, but also to take into account the kind of reaction in the region with regard to more of US presence through AUKUS, through Quad, through other kind of unilateral that we can anticipate in the coming future. So that's what I will say, for now.
Thanks, Keng Yong. Richard, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. So what you are seeing has been going on for probably a good 10 years at this point, which is the emergence of a web of ties, especially but not limited to security ties, throughout the Indo-Pacific that are much more informal than America's 5 treaty alliances in the region with the 5 countries with which we have mutual defense agreements. Of course, we have 5 mutual defense agreements in the region with allies, none of whom have one with each other, right? But for many decades, that was the pattern of behavior. The United States would deal sort of unilaterally or bilaterally with each of these countries and in terms of their own security, but not a lot with each other and so forth. And you're really seeing this not be superseded, but be augmented by this informal network of ties. So you see AUKUS, you see the Quad, you see the South Korea, Japan, US sort of trilateral, you see the Japan, Philippines, US trilateral work, but you also see things that don't include the United States, which one is generally good for this kind of overall security networking, and 2, the US has to be comfortable with this happening without the US being in the room, right? So you have Japan and Australia, for example, cooperating more closely, especially in security terms than they have before. India and Japan and the Philippines. So there's, countries are participating in each other's military exercises the way they haven't before. There's arms sales in the ways that they haven't before. There's diplomatic coordination to a greater degree than before. There are access agreements allowing access to each other's forces. Again, sometimes including the US, sometimes not including the US. And none of this is specifically tied to the 5 treaty alliances. These are, really a response to, hedging against uncertainties around China's rise and to some degree uncertainties about America's long-term presence there, because some of these things, as I said, don't include the United States.
Thank you. Well, I would agree with you, Richard, because I think what Secretary Austin said at Shangri-La is just a recognition of something that's been underway for a very long time, right? There'll always be a role for the formal alliances, but there are other things. There are things that maybe not work very well, but there's certain ASEAN frameworks. There's the SCO. You have partnerships that are short of alliances like those with India and Singapore. You have less formal, but nonetheless significant relationships with, let's say, Vietnam or Indonesia and Malaysia. And this is, I think, an illustration of what I talked about at the beginning, of dynamic multipolarity, of coalitions forming and reforming around different issues in response to the 2 fundamental realities we face, that we have to deal with you and the Chinese, and we have concerns about you and the Chinese. It's a kind of hedging, if you like. Another question that has just come up from Lin Jing. This is it. And there's, I guess, King Yong, since it's about Iran, you are ambassador to Iran still, right? Non-resident. You should take the first cut, and then, Richard and then me. Given the recent presidential election in Iran, do you foresee any significant implications for US-China relations?
I don't think. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I don't think there will be any immediate consequences that we can all huddle around and wonder what's next. Although everyone feel that the elected president is a more quote-unquote moderate guy, there are many other issues. Many of them are very emotional with regard to the role of the Revolutionary Guards, the death of many of these other individuals, which they attributed to the competition with the United States or the West. So even if there is a plan to loosen up or to reach out more positively, it will take some time. So the question is whether the Gaza situation and now the intensifying activities in southern Lebanon will have any impact. I think right now, if I read the situation in Tehran correctly, the newly elected president would have to take his dressing from what the supreme leader would like to do going forward. Everybody think that the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran is the decision maker. He is not a decision maker in this area, which is completely dominated by the supreme leader himself. But tactically, maybe, learning from his experience as a former health minister, interacting with other countries around Iran and beyond, his interest is to try to find a bit of a freshness in Iran's foreign relations and see how he can then persuade the supreme leader of Iran to encourage a bit more positive vibes going forward. Right now, I would say just wait and see. I don't think there will be anything dramatic, and hopefully the more hardline groups inside Iran will not instigate their friends in Lebanon or Yemen or elsewhere in the Middle East theater to raise the stake by throwing a few smoke bombs here and there. We don't know. Yeah. But let's see how this outcome of the presidential election will impact on the broader regional picture in the Gulf.
Richard?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the supreme leader is, well, he's the supreme leader, and certainly on foreign policy and the Guardian Council and the Quds Force and the IRGC and all of this are going to be ultimately much more influential in the making of Iranian foreign policy. So I don't think you can expect any significant change. That said, I think the election of President-elect Pezeshkian is interesting because of what it tells us about where the Iranian people are. It was, if you look at the turnout, they did come out in significant numbers during the runoff in order to put him over the top. And he ran essentially on a platform of discontent with certain things, the hijab law, the state of the economy, the sort of confrontation with the West, including over the nuclear program that is leading to sanctions, which are harming the economy and so forth. That doesn't mean that those things will change. Again, he can't just sort of unilaterally change those things. But I do think it's an important barometer, and certainly probably will be interpreted that way by the rest of the government. That there's significant discontent inside Iran with both domestic law and with the foreign policy approach that the government has pursued.
Thank you. Well, I kind of agree with both of you. The president is not all that important, especially where foreign policy is concerned. He may want to try to improve atmospherics, but on the key foreign policy issue, which is the nuclear issue, I think he will have zero influence. Another question which comes from Edmund Lim. What are the anticipated developments in foreign policy towards North Korea and China with the Trump administration? Who are the leading influencers in the next Trump administration if he is elected? Well, I'll take the first. I'll give a first cut at this. I don't think there's going to be any change in policy towards China, except it may become harder insofar as if he's serious about trying to tone down the war in Ukraine, he will need some issue to show that he's a tough guy, and that issue will be China. North Korea, I think we have to admit that he dealt with North Korea maybe purely by accident, but much better than Obama did in his first term. He basically restored deterrence. Who are the leading influencers in the next Trump administration? I'll leave it to you, Richard, to answer that one.
I'm surprised we got this far into the conversation before what happens in a Trump administration.
No, I've been keeping back those questions, but
okay.
questions.
Okay, well, here we go. Just in terms of issues, I think there's largely going to be significant continuity, as you said, on the China issues. I mean, if you look at President Biden's China policy, it's much closer to Trump's policy than it is to Obama's policy. I mean, if there's one area of commonality across parties and across very different administrations, it's now a consensus, generally speaking, on China policy. North Korea policy, the Trump administration, Trump himself, tried everything, including the unthinkable in his first term. He went to the United Nations and threatened to wipe North Korea off the face of the earth, and called Kim Jong-un little rocket man and all of this. And then obviously, as we all know, went to multiple places to meet with Kim Jong-un and conduct personal diplomacy. And none of that actually produced a breakthrough. It settled things down, which was good. But I think it persuaded, at long last, folks on the American side that there is not a breakthrough to be had. There's not some combination of carrots and sticks or diplomacy or personal persuasion or charm that the United States can engage in that's going to get the North Koreans to just hand over all their nuclear weapons. And so you're sort of stuck with mitigating this problem rather than trying to solve it once for all. And there, I expect it would be a combination of, pressure and maybe some diplomacy in order to try to do that. As far as, who would serve in a Trump administration, there are folks who, Robert O'Brien, who is his last of national security advisor, has a long article in Foreign Affairs laying out some themes for, that may be resonant in a Trump administration. Who knows whether Robert would would go back in, but he could. There are other people that served before, like General Keith Kellogg and Mike Pompeo and my friend Rich Colby and others who may go back in different ways. But one thing that's almost impossible if you live in Washington long enough is accurately predicting who's going to go into an administration and what job they will actually take, because it seems to always upend predictions. So those are some of the folks kind of around the hoop, as we would say in basketball, but who actually goes in, who knows?
Keng Yong?
Yeah, I don't know how to explain the next movement or the next policy coming out from Washington, D.C. But the thing is that if your book, Richard, has hit the nail on the head for all the reason why U.S. Policy or pivot towards Asia did not succeed or has not worked out the way people in Washington would like to have, then I think they have to also look at this particular question. Yeah, going forward, the people in China, the people in Russia, and I would say people in Southeast Asia and India, more importantly, don't forget India. The next stage of this whole exercise about how to deal with the reality out there is the role of India. And the Indian policy guys are already scrambling with different research think tank, as far as I know, to see all the other possibilities. So it really depends on who will come in to assist the new president in Washington. I don't know whether it is guaranteed to be Donald Trump or it still have a very good chance for the Democrats. But right now, I think people are looking probably at your book to see what are the 7 failures of the past pivot policy, how to avoid that, and then who else can people in Washington work with beyond the usual group of suspects, as we call them. Yeah, and I think the role of India will be quite significant. Yeah, and this will bring us into another level of discomfort, because the Indian policy guys are very focused on Indian Ocean, and they are very jealously guarding their interest in that patch of geography. Right now, there is a big problem in Myanmar, and hopefully, as things settle down a bit in domestic India, some effort will be made to see what else can be done to manage the development in Myanmar. Thank you, Bilari.
Well, the last question was actually about the Trump administration. And the next question, and the last remaining question, is also about the Trump administration. So let me try to do this in a slightly different way, all right? I'll make a statement, a short statement, and you two respond to it. Right? Okay? I mean, let's not try to get to this rather futile game or trying to predict who is going to take what position and so on. I agree with you. It's a fool's errand, right? You're always going to get blindsided one way or the other, right? But let me just make this statement. I think of all the regions, the major regions of the world, Asia will probably be relatively less affected. Relatively less affected does not mean unaffected, right? Why do I say that? I say that for a number of reasons. One, the big pieces of Asia policy are not going to change. China policy is not going to change. Trade policy is not going to change. And beyond these specific policies, I think Asia, including US allies, have always dealt with the US much more on the basis of common interests rather than common values, real or imagined. And therefore, we have always been much more pragmatic. There's only one America. It has a vital role in this region, and we'll find a way of working with whoever sits in the White House. I think as far as the Middle East is concerned, most countries are looking forward to a Trump administration, right? even Iran, I think, because insofar as the new president would want to try to improve relations with the West, and insofar as the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guard don't like it, the most effective block to that will be a Trump administration if he behaves towards Iran as he did in the past. The region that's going to be most affected badly, it will be Europe. We don't know what he will do over Ukraine, although if we take his words at face value, and there's no reason why we shouldn't, the Europeans will have to find money to make up the slack that America is going to leave. And they don't have the money. They will have to cut their social spending, and that will cause all kinds of political turmoil. My last point is back to Asia. I think there are two issues in which there are still question marks. One, Taiwan. Mr. Biden said 4 times, at least, that he will defend Taiwan. Now, 4 times is not an accident. As much as he may be susceptible to misspeaking, 4 times, if you say the same thing, you mean it. Will Mr. Trump have the same kind of commitment? We don't know. Secondly, in the trade policy, I think it seems very clear there is going to be much less toleration for Chinese backdooring into the United States or China washing itself. And that will be, I mean, the main target, the initial target will be Mexico, probably, but Southeast Asia, including Singapore, may not be far behind. Now, would you all like to comment on that?
I think that was a good rundown. So I generally agree with what you said. I would just say, in terms of the question marks, if there's a Trump administration, certainly Taiwan, for the reason that you just said.
Yeah.
I think there's also a question about what would be prioritized in the U.S.-China relationship, because right now it is not the trade deficit. It is not trying to get China to agree via negotiations to major purchase agreements of, say, $500 billion in U.S. products. That was, for a number of years in the Trump administration, the top objective, which was we need to reduce the trade deficit. China has to abide by its phase 1 purchase agreements. Only then can we get to phase 2. And in the meantime, we'll just keep jacking up the tariffs and things like that. So the focus of what is the objective of U.S.-China policy, even if it remains tense and competitive in Biden and in Trump, I think could be quite different. And then, as much as we sort of try to predict what will happen with, North Korea, that's always the outlier. I mean, if North Korea starts testing, nuclear weapons and ICBMs in earnest and demonstrates that in exchange for the 2 million rounds of ammunition provided to Russia, that Russia provided it with some, defense technology that it didn't previously have, that it would like to demonstrate, it can foment a sense of crisis pretty quickly. And, then we're sort of back to where we were. But generally speaking, Bilahari, I think you nailed it pretty well.
Oh, thank you. Kenyo?
Yeah, I think you have done a good job in that summary. But I think, actually, my question to Richard is, can we get Europe to do more? Yeah. I think your book indicate that the European may be restless and discomforted by what has happened so far. But are they doing anything about it? They can't always depend on Washington to do all the strategic and the big picture stuff. Then, after coming back just 2 days ago from India, I just feel that the Indian policy people are really going to be very active in the coming 1 to 2 years. And how does that synchronize with the interest of the European to do more? They are now focused on the Indian Ocean, and this will be somewhere near to your American significant interest. So we will have to watch this a little bit more closely. But otherwise, Bilahari, your general overview is something that we all have to work on. And hopefully things will turn out better than what we fear. Thank you.
Well, was hoping for more disagreement because we have some time left and no more questions. Okay, but anyway,
I can
Richard,
just
we have about 5 minutes, and I'll give it to you for any last thoughts on your book or what we have discussed today.
Yeah, sure. Well, just to respond to those last couple of questions, can the Europeans do more? They've started doing more. I mean, the biggest catalyst to this has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to be sure. But if you look, for example, at at the Wales NATO summit, the allies pledged to spend 2% of GDP on defense, and then many of them promptly didn't. As of a couple of years ago, the number of NATO members spending 2% of GDP on defense was something like 7. By the end of this year, it'll be something like 25. So that's increased. And I think actually President Trump in his exhortations probably played some role in pushing that up as well. That said, there are limits. I mean, Bill Hari was talking about some of the limits when it comes to defense spending and the trade-off between guns and butter, and metaphorically speaking, in Europe. But it's always been the case that Europe has not believed itself capable of defending the continent without American help since 1945. I mean, the United States has never went home after World War II. And so it has provided both a strategic and a conventional security umbrella over Europe. And that's not going to change anytime soon. The question is kind of in what direction will this go, and will increased European capabilities allow for the United States to redeploy some of its resources to places like Asia? And I think the answer is yes, but not at the speed, at least that I think is required, either by virtue of the challenge in the Indo-Pacific or the way the Europeans should be responding with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, just to give one quick example, I mean, Russia, in the space of about 2 years, really has built a war economy. I mean, it's churning out munitions and Iranian designed and made drones and things like that. And Europe had the same 2 years, but did not actually boost its industrial production in any way comparable to what Russia did. And you can see the effects on the battlefield when it comes to the availability of munitions and other things like that. On your question on India, I wish my co-author Bob Blackwill was here, since he, of course, was ambassador to India and was sort of present at the creation of the transformation of the U.S.-India relationship. If there's been one bipartisan success over 25 years now, it actually has been the increasing closeness between the United States and India, which has different parties in India in charge, different parties in the United States in charge, but really has changed dramatically for the better, and that is all to the good. I mean, the Europeans, my experience with India and with Europeans interested in India is they're more interested in sort of the commercial side of things than anything else with respect to India, and less so on sort of the strategic matters up in the Himalayas or in the Indian Ocean, or kind of big picture balancing, things like that. And so I don't see tension between the U.S. and the Europeans on India, but rather continue possibilities for a deepened U.S.-India relationship over the long run. And again, part of this is driven by China itself and the fighting up in the Himalayas. So now, with my grand total of 2 minutes left in this, all I will say is thank you all for participating in the conversation. Great questions. And Ken Young and Bill Hari, thank you for hosting and for your insightful comments on this. And hopefully this book and this conversation is a little bit of a contribution to some of the thinking that certainly Americans have to do as we go and vote here in November and try to figure out what to do in 2025 at home and in the world.
Yeah, let's hope it will not be another lost decade.
No. It won't be another lost decade. But thank you for giving us this opportunity, Richard. My thanks to Ambassador Blackwill too. Thank you, Ken Yong. And thank all our audience for taking the trouble to not just log in, but stay logged in, because I see that numbers hasn't changed too much over time. We have a number of embassies who have remained with us, and a few people from overseas. I see at least 2 names which I know are in Japan, and I think one that might be in Europe. So thank all of you, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.